This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. We will also explore threats to meaningful engagement in sport and movement culture practices and ask questions about what we can learn about the human condition through our involvement in sport. The guests are leading scholars in human and social sciences of sport who will share their explorations in a scholarly as well as a personal context. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. I'm very excited about today's episode, which will be the first time that we focus on outdoor education and nature-based physical activity and sports in this podcast. Nature-based activities have become very popular, especially during the COVID pandemic, when the lockdowns have prevented many people from visiting gyms and playing team sports and doing those activities that are maybe not possible at this time of our life. But I would say that there is also a broader general trend of growth of interest in nature-based sports and adventures, as well as we have pressing questions about how we can live more sustainable lives and whether nature-based movement activities can contribute to these goals. I'm really delighted to introduce our guest who will help us explore some of these issues and questions. He joined the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences 1 year ago and is a professor of outdoor studies at NIH, as we know it. Before this, he was at the University of Edinburgh for almost 15 years and still retains a .2 position there. He has published 5 books, including Adventurous Learning and Adventure and Society, which will form the basis for some of the things that we will be discussing today. So, welcome, Professor Simon Beans, and thank you so much for joining me for today's exciting discussion.
Well, it really is a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for that lovely introduction. You've got me all nervous now that I better say something very clever during our talk. But yeah, looking forward to our discussion. Thank you, Noora.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And I mean, these nature-based and outdoor activities are like a big part of my life, hiking, running on trails and mountain biking. But I really look forward to somebody like you who has worked in this area for so long to provide me a bit more theory-informed discussions on what is actually going on. And so I guess as a start, I already mentioned about the COVID pandemic is something that probably disrupted people's activities. And at least I was seeing a lot more people like on trails if I would go running, and the forest was becoming quite busy especially during the time of the lockdowns when you can't access the gym or any of the indoor facilities. But so correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess that's still part of a broader trend that we might be witnessing a surge of interest on nature sports, nature-based physical activity and recreation. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, where we are going with that.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of this also has to do with where we are in the world, where people are. So, for example, I feel like I was lucky to have been living in Scandinavia and Norway in particular during the lockdown because I had fantastic access to the trails, and so I was wonderful to be able to go for a long walk in the woods every day, or for a bike ride or a run. But it wasn't like that for a lot of people. For example, I know that colleagues in the UK were only allowed out for an hour a day, for example.
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
so I think COVID had it kind of really shuffled the deck regarding sort of who are the winners and losers. And what I mean by that is that I think that the lockdown sort of demands that we ask different questions about who's being disadvantaged by these new social arrangements. Because, yeah, it's true. Like in Norway, there were all kinds of sort of outdoor pieces of equipment that were sold out in stores because everybody wanted to, a hammock or to buy a new bicycle or whatever. I understand that the number of pets that were bought and acquired, maybe that's a better word, house pets, dogs and so on, were really went up as well. So I think that what's interesting to me is what COVID did in terms of rearranging the way we live our lives on a social level. So in terms of the outdoors, yeah, I feel like a lot of us in living in Scandinavia, we were able to kind of, many of us were advantaged by that, for those who had the means to be able to get outside, and while other people in other countries and perhaps even other parts of Norway were not able to do that. So maybe a rambling answer there, but I think that it really depends where we are and who we're talking about in terms of specific populations, in terms of the influence that it might have had on outdoor nature, leisure habits or time.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts, kind of the broader trends that I've seen more papers on these more sustainable sports, and there seems to be some romantic ideas about, let's go back to nature, let's reconnect with the world and reconnect with ourselves through being out there in the nature, and these ideas about alienation and, how we are sitting on our computers all day long,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and how our lifestyles are. This is not a new idea at all, but it just seems to me that it might be becoming again in like maybe a trend or idea that is circulating out there.
I think it is. I think this whole, I think what COVID has done has accelerated this trend. So I think, as you were suggesting, it existed already, and living in this hypermodern world where everything's faster and faster, and communications are speeding up, and there's our abilities to do different tasks at the same time more quickly are pervading more and more of our day-to-day lives. And I think then what COVID has done is has brought that to the fore even more. So we don't need to perhaps travel as much, but we're on the screen all the time. But because of that, I think there are certain issues around health and well-being which have come to the fore, both physical health and mental health. So if COVID and the lockdowns and teaching and working remotely or what have you are causing us to be in front of the screen for long hours of the day, very sedentary, sitting in a chair or working maybe even sitting in bed, for example. If someone else in the house is using the kitchen table, then there are, I think, more and more people just looking for that a little bit of fresh air, looking for some kind of natural connection, looking for some kind of physical exercise almost as a kind of renewal or cleansing. I know I certainly that is my own experience. I've really felt like, okay, wow, this has been a few hours in front of the screen on Zoom meetings, and I just need to go and kind of reset.
Isn't it kind of paradoxical that at the same time as we are more connected in a sense that you can now talk to anyone anywhere in the world, and well, before the COVID you could travel anywhere, take a plane, and that was part of very connected world. But at the same time we talk a lot about like alienation, loneliness, disconnection at the same time. So by becoming more connected, we actually also become more disconnected at the same time.
Well, that's it. I think that, and it's what are the how are we connected? I mean, in some ways, I'm more connected to friends around the world than I was before COVID through video and audio means, and that's been, that's wonderful. But I think we also need a certain human face-to-face connection, and I just can't imagine having people who have lived alone through these various degrees of lockdown, particularly older people. I mean, it's just I think that in terms of mental health and loneliness, as you were saying, it's just so difficult.
Yeah, I haven't followed the news here in Norway as closely as I probably should have, but I think there have been now the concerns about, and like that a lot of effort should be put on helping, especially older people who now cannot, like due to COVID, you almost have to lock yourself into your home at least in the coming months when things are probably getting worse, and how you can support those people.
Yeah.
So yeah, some of the really big things. So nature and connectedness. Let's just put you a big statement that, if we just go back to nature, are we going to solve all our big problems of alienation and planetary destruction, disconnectedness, all of that? You can just say yes and we can finish the episode, or is it more complicated than that?
Right, yeah. Wow, what a question. Well, I think the answer to that is, well, maybe if we did all completely abandon all our material possessions and went back to some kind of pre-industrial existence, yeah, I think the planet and its ecosystems would probably be much healthier. But that's probably complete, that just so far-fetched, it's never going to happen. So how do we? So what is the next question then? Is it how do we sort of how do I mean the classic kind of term of, and how do we dwell well in our places? Perhaps that is a more appropriate question for these times, because I do agree with you. I mean, I think that if we were to go back to these pre-industrial times, we might feel like we had stronger relationships with each other and with the places in which we live, and be more intertwined with the ecosystems that support us and so on. But we might also die earlier, have a lot of sickness. We might suffer from the cold. We might all kinds of things like that. So yeah, so I think that the question is, as you say, much more complex. The answer is much more complex in terms of how do we live well and find some kind of balance between living in this world where we've got these extraordinary means of communication and these social circumstances that are shifting so rapidly. I mean, you just think of how the jobs that have been lost, changed, services in society just in the last 7 months has been extraordinary. So what perhaps a question that we need to look at is what is nature's role and sort of our time in nature. Like how can we best be stewards of these natural spaces, but also how can we use it to how can we best focus or mobilize our talents and capacities to build strong, resilient communities who live lightly on the earth.
And I mean, these questions about sustainability, how can we dwell in a good way? How can we live in more sustainable ways, individually, collectively? Obviously, those are, well, before COVID took over, those were really the big questions that were at the forefront of the human agenda, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there is also now in sports philosophy, I'm certain in your field of studies more as well, these questions about what could be more sustainable ways of doing sports and exercise. And I mean, some scholars, or there would be some discussions about nature sport being the more sustainable, more spiritual, I guess you could say more meaningful way of being active than some of the so-called mainstream sports. But I guess it's not that simple, and I think in your work you have very clearly kind of pointed out some problems with these nature-based sports, or you are writing about adventure. So maybe we can explore kind of the relationship between the so-called mainstream sport cultures and then these alternative and more nature-based sport cultures. How do you view their relation?
Sure, yeah. Well, I suppose I would say that I wouldn't want to say that that anybody involved in some kind of adventure sport or some kind of lifestyle sport, as Belinda Wheaton calls them, to be any more meaningful than someone who's playing football, soccer, for example. But what I am interested in is how we are thinking about the adventures that we undertake. And I guess what I mean by adventures is it in a kind of more classic sense in terms of the trips we might go on, a camping trip or some kind of expedition, or the more daily adventurous practices of going mountain biking or climbing or surfing or what have you. And so I think what's interesting to me is how people who are engaged in those activities are thinking about sustainability when they make their choices about how they do their activity. So, for example, where are they going? Are people flying to the other side of the world to do to go mountain biking? Are people, what kind of choices are people making about the clothing they wear or the equipment they buy, in terms of like, do they know what kinds of raw materials were used in making the equipment and where it came from, and what were the labor conditions that were employed for the people who were manufacturing some of the equipment that we're using, for example. So I think we need to be asking ourselves those questions. How are we, and then back to the kind of where is the activity taking place? Are we able to? Do each of us have to drive there? Can we take public transport for some of the way? And of course, for some people who are involved in various expeditions or adventure sports, it just may not be that you can buy a particular jacket with certain functions that was made by people who were paid a very good wage, and it doesn't have any petroleum based products in it, and where no habitat was damaged. That can be, I mean, maybe that jacket exists, but it'll cost a fortune. The kind of money that most of us can't spend, and the activity that we may want to do. It may be very unlikely that there's any kind of public transport that's going to take us, to the cliff we want to climb or jump off of, or what have you. And so there may be an element of carbon emission associated with some of those habits. I don't have all the answers, I must add, but I think those, but as performers or practitioners or whatever we want to label ourselves, we absolutely have to be asking ourselves those questions about the choices we're making and make our peace with them.
I think the point you are making is really, really important, that I would guess, and also on my part, like part of the reasons why I really love to go for hikes and run on the trails is to feel that I'm closer to nature and connect. And I mean, a lot of people who are doing that are also concerned about the environment and sustainability. But if we look at that from just what you said about how you get there and what kind of gear you're buying and all that stuff, actually the more ecological and more sustainable way of doing sports is to play football on the pitch that is like 300 meters from your home in some
right.
cases, I guess.
Yeah.
And you already talked about equipment, having this traveling. Some people want to climb a mountain on each continent and would do like massive amounts of traveling. I guess the other part that you're talking about in your later book, in the Adventure and Society, was also about this commodification of adventure. So both the experience as the products as well. So what are we getting with our adventure experience? Yeah, maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Sure, and I think that's where there's some interesting overlap between the worlds of tourism and education, because both of those fields, in a way, need to make money to survive. And as we're seeing in a lot of places in the world, particularly there's a lot of attention right now in the UK on outdoor centers, residential outdoor centers that are closing because they just don't have the money coming in right now from their the schools visiting. But one way they overlap in terms of commodification is that they do need to generate income, whether they're a for-profit or not-for-profit organization. And generally, the easiest way to do that is to provide services or products that don't require as much kind of one-on-one attention, if you like. So, for example, it's and the classic case that Chris Loynes first wrote about in '96 and then again in '98 is the McDonaldization of adventure. Adventure in a bun, he called it. And this whole idea of you know how you might go to a McDonald's restaurant, whether it's in Beijing or in San Francisco or in Oslo, and the idea is that the product's going to taste the same wherever you go, right? The Big Mac is going to taste like a Big Mac in all those places, so it has a certain predictability about it. And the way that the Big Macs are made are pretty much identical in terms of how it's made, and in terms of the equipment and the procedure, if you like, to make the Big Mac. So the argument here is that if you want to be a successful revenue generating organization, as McDonald's obviously has been because they are still around, is that there needs to be a certain amount of predictability and calculability, and eventually some kind of automation that will accompany these services. So the problem with these, when this is applied in the world of outdoor adventure, whether it's for educational purposes or whether it's for tourism, is that it doesn't cater to everyone well enough. It sort of gives everybody roughly the same product. And it's going to be pretty predictable. Certainly, there should be in both sectors. There should be no reason for anybody to become seriously harmed, because that is also not very good for business, right? When people get seriously harmed. So really, this is so even though it's called adventure, often there's very little that is adventurous within them, because they do, in order to be successful as organizations, have to have some kind of predictability and calculability to in order to survive, because they're in terms of having ratios that are going to mean that they don't have to pay huge wage bills for their employees and so on. And they know exactly what they're doing tomorrow morning and the morning after, and the morning after, how much equipment they're going to need, what equipment. It all becomes nicely packaged and replicable.
In one of those, I can't remember which book you kind of put it, but it's a nice example that we don't like adventures such as when our car breaks down, for example, or like when your bicycle breaks down in the middle of nowhere and you have to like get a long way back, or when your all your luggage has disappeared when you get off the plane, and those are adventures as well, but we don't want that kind of adventures. And we want the ones when everything works.
We want our adventures to go according to plan, which in itself, is almost an absurd statement. So we want our adventures to go according to plan, and I'm even though I write about this stuff, I do not like things to not go according to plan. I want, if I'm going to go on a hut to hut hike or whatever, I want to make sure that I get to where I'm going that night, and I've looked at the weather forecast very carefully. I've packed my rucksack very carefully. I've got everything I need in it to be comfortable if things don't go quite according to plan. But I want things to go a certain way, and I'm probably not the best ambassador for adventure when there is a flat tire, or when something unexpected happens. So I think that's what also makes this whole field of adventure so interesting to me is a lot of the adventures that, when we're talking about adventure in society, people are what we're talking about in that book. Chris and Matt and I, we're talking about people's planned adventures. We're talking about things that people are choosing to do with their leisure time, with their money, and the choices they're making. But they're very much planned adventures. Everything's very deliberate.
I've thought about that, and when now here in Oslo, that I've also been here now for a couple of months, and almost every time we go for a run somewhere, leave from the sports sciences school, and then when you go to the forest in Nordmarka, like, you always get lost because there are too many trails, even if you take a look at the map, and you might end up eventually where you want, but almost every time there is a point when we are a little bit lost. And then I've been thinking about that did we come here to get everything exactly as we wanted? Like, you should run on the track if you want things to be exactly as you planned. So why to get upset if you're a bit lost? Isn't that part of the point of doing that?
Yeah. So let's say if I was going to meet you at somewhere in Oslo tomorrow, and I'd never been, and I said I'm going to meet you at 1:30 p.m. and then I took the metro down, and but I got lost, and I was going to be 20 minutes late. I would be furious at myself that I got lost, and I'm going to let you down because I'm going to be late. But if I know that I'm going to go for a 40-minute run in the woods, and I love getting lost because I know that it's not going to be forever, and it's really not going to change much, and I'm going to enjoy that. I don't. It would be a bit too much to call it a liminal space, but I really want to almost get lost and be in a place where I don't know quite where I am, and that has caused some of my attention to be heightened about, I better pay attention to the landscape a bit more, where I might see a trail that's going to bring me back around, because I know I'm going roughly counterclockwise right now. And I'll bang into that, I'll eventually hit that main trail that comes back. So I love that, but because it's almost like there's this kind of these limits for within the boundaries that I have chosen. That is where I want my unscripted, unplanned events to happen, but I don't want them to happen out of those boundaries that I've set. And that's my little kind of edge work for the day. And after that, I kind of want everything to be quite predictable.
Yeah. Let's talk then about authenticity. Let's talk about authenticity of these adventure experiences. So if we're getting quite a pre-packaged trip to do a mountain bike tour that is going to be exactly 3 hours and 30 minutes, and then you have a nice meal and everything's very much set up for you, and just like we discussed, there isn't a lot of unpredictable or not so many unpredictable elements in that, because everything has been set up to be exactly what is sold to you. So how do you think about authenticity and these experiences?
Well, I'll start by saying, so let's use your example of the buying a day of mountain biking that ends up, for maybe you're being taken around by some kind of guide and you go for a nice tour after. Well, I suppose, who am I to say that that is not 100% authentic for another person? But some people, I suppose, might think, oh, well, I that perhaps is not as authentic as it could be, because, oh, I don't want to be guided and I'd rather cook my own food or what have you. So I think that whole authenticity question is a really tricky one, because I think there's a certain subjectivity that is within it. So yeah, difficult to make a too big a statement on that without getting in trouble, I think. All of the activities that we undertake at some point, even if it's, say, you and I going for a walk in the woods and we decide that we're going to stop on this, nice lookout point, and maybe we're going to have even a little fire and have some nice tea and kanelboller, and I mean, maybe that could be seen as, oh, that's quite authentic, but at some degree, all of these experiences are contrived. We have gone some way to saying we are going to create the circumstances for having this experience together. So at some point they are contrived, and we have decided that these are the ingredients of this experience that we want to have. So it may, but so I think it's really difficult to say, is something more or less authentic in that way. And I suppose then it comes back to how it makes us feel. That does one kind of experience make one feel more in touch with oneself, like, oh, this is the real me, and this is the way I am feeling when I'm completely out with the influence of society. Because I think we're all bombarded with these messages all the time, maybe even when we're sleeping some of the time, because there might be some residual things happening in our brains from whatever kinds of messages we've been exposed to during the day. But so where I was going with that was, I suppose we can have feelings of authenticity probably just about anywhere. But I think in order to have those feelings of authenticity, we have to feel that the emotions, the senses that we are experiencing are as unchecked by society as possible. So I need to feel, or one needs to feel, that they are thinking or acting a certain way, because that is somehow deep down in their being the purest of feelings, and that has not been colored by what your friends or your colleagues or somebody on Instagram or YouTube thinks. So, and sort of just pulling away all of that and thinking, well, deep down, what do I think? What do I feel? So I think that's at the heart of it. And so I think many people do feel that the green spaces, quiet time spent in nature can be like a kind of retreat, like some kind of church even. I mean, it's so I think because of course, I mean, all kinds of people will go to different. They will find that sanctuary and that seek out that authenticity in different realms, different spaces. And so I think that for some people it will be the forest or the walk on the beach when that gives a bit of distance from those influencing factors, and so deep breaths can be taken, and one can think, right, this is who I am again. Yeah, I remember me. This is it. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcast or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.